one of the things that President Trump is doing is actually negotiating trade. And American independence was actually brought about, the triggering was the Boston Tea Party, was tea. So a great benefit, a great happening came out of thorough exasperation with the British from her colonial people in North America. And it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and God bless that fact. This is just one of the causes, but maybe it was the tipping point. The North Ministry solution was the Tea Act, which received the assent of King George in May 1773. This act restored the East Indian Company's full refund on the duty for importing tea into Britain, and also permitted the company. The North Ministry's solution was the Tea Act, which received the assent of King George in May 1773. This act restored the East Indian Company full refund on the duty of the importing tea into Britain, and also permitted the company for the first time to export tea to the colonies on its own account. This would allow the company to reduce costs by limiting the middlemen who brought the tea at wholesale auctions in London instead of selling to middlemen. The company now appointed colonial merchants to receive the tea on consignment. The consignee would in turn sell the tea for a commission. In July 1773, tea consignees were selected in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. The Tea Act retained the 3p Townshend duty on tea import to the colonies. Some members of Parliament wanted to eliminate this tax, arguing that there was no reason to provoke another colonial controversy. However, Prime Minister North did not want to give up the revenue from the Townshend tax, primarily because it was used to pay the salaries of colonial officials. Maintaining the right of taxing the Americans was of a secondary concern. This is Lord North, seen here in portrait of Frederick North, Lord North, 1773-1774, painted by Nathaniel Dance, was Prime Minister at the time of the passage of the Tea Act. So just to continue down, whoopsie-daisy, so I continue. Upon hearing word of the details of the British Tea Act of 1773, the Sons of Liberty took action after officials in Boston refused to return 3 shiploads of taxed tea to Britain. The Boston Tea Party was the culmination of a resistance movement throughout British America against the Tea Act, which had been passed by the British Parliament in 1773. Colonists objected to the Tea Act for a variety of reasons, especially because they believed that it violated their right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. Protesters had successfully prevented the unloading of the taxed tea in 3 other colonies, but the Boston embattled royal governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the tea to be returned to Britain. Background: in September and October of 1773, 7 ships carrying British East Indian Company tea were sent to the colonies. 4 were bound for Boston, New York and Philadelphia, and Charleston. In the ships were more than 2,000 chests containing nearly 600,000 pounds of tea. The Americans learned the details of the Tea Act while the ships were en route, and opposition began to mount. Activists calling themselves the Sons of Liberty began a campaign to raise awareness and to convince or compel the consignees to resign, in the same way that stamp distributors had been forced to resign in 1765 Stamp Act crisis. Now that's interesting because, according to my mother, family is connected to Sir Rowland Hill, who instigated and had to get it through Parliament, which wasn't easy, the penny black stamp, because he saw as a young boy the anguish of his mother every day in case a letter arrived which the receivee had to pay. And in 1840, it was in 1840 that the first penny black stamp was actually brought into being. I think I'm correct there. My mother told me that she had threaded many penny black stamps with a needle and onto some string. So people that were stamp collecting would be going, oh! Anyway. And interestingly enough, in Hampstead, very close to the Royal Free Hospital, there is a street named Rowland Hill. And I passed it very often. It was a nice reminder. However, my cousin did research and she said, no, there is no connection. But anyway, my mother was quite convinced that there was. So here we are talking about the Stamp Act. Wonderful picture of a clipper. So south of Boston, protesters successfully compelled the tea consignees to resign in Charleston. The consignee had been forced to resign in early December, and unclaimed tea was seized by customs officials. By early December, the Philadelphia consignees had resigned, and the tea ships returned to England with the cargo following a confrontation with the ship's captain. The tea ship bound to New York City was delayed by bad weather. By the time it had arrived, the consignee had resigned, and the ship returned to England with the tea. So here we've got standoff in Boston. In every colony except for Massachusetts, protesters were able to force the tea consignees to resign or to return the tea to England. In Boston, however, Governor Hutchinson was determined to hold his ground. He convinced the tea consignees, two of whom were his sons, not to back down. When the tea ship Dartmouth arrived in Boston Harbor in the late November, Sons of Liberty leader Samuel Adams called for a mass meeting. British law required the Dartmouth to unload and pay the duties within 20 days of the customs officials, or customs officials could confiscate the cargo. The mass meeting passed a resolution introduced by Adams and based on a similar set of resolutions promulgated earlier in Philadelphia, urging the captain of the Dartmouth to send the ship back without paying the import duty. Meanwhile, the meeting assigned men to watch the ship and prevent the tea from being unloaded. Governor Hutchinson refused to grant permission for the Dartmouth to leave without paying the duty. Meanwhile, two more tea ships, the Eleanor and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor. While Adams tried to reassert control of the meeting, people poured out of the Old South Meeting House to prepare to take action. On the evening of December the 16th, a small group of colonists, some dressed in Mohawk warrior disguises, boarded the three vessels and over the course of the 3 hours dumped all 342 chests of tea into the water. Protected by a crowd of spectators, they simultaneously destroyed goods worth almost 1 million in today's dollars, a very significant loss. Whether or not, so I'll read that again, protected by a crowd of spectators, they systematically destroyed goods worth almost 1 million in today's dollars, a very significant loss. Whether or not Samuel Adams helped plan the Boston Tea Party is disputed, but his immediate work to publicize and defend it. He argued that the Tea Party was not the active lawless mob, but was instead a principled protest and the only remaining option the people had to defend their constitutional rights. By constitution, he was referring to the idea that all governments have a constitution, written or not, and that the Constitution of Great Britain could be interpreted as banning the levy of taxes without representation. This act inspired further acts of resistance up and down the East Coast. However, not all colonists and not even all patriots supported the dumping of the tea. The wholesale destruction of property shocked the people on both sides of the Atlantic. In Britain, this act united all parties against the colonies. The British government felt this act could not remain unpunished. They responded by closing the port of Boston and putting in place other laws known as the Coercive Acts. The tax on tea was repealed with the Taxation of the Colonies Act in 1778, part of another parliamentary attempt at conciliation that evidently failed. The Coercive Act was meant to reverse the trend of colonial resistance, but actually revoked higher levels of resistance. So to continue, the Coercive Act, or Coercive Acts, are names used to describe a series of laws relating to British colonies in North America and passed by the British Parliament in 1774. 4 of the acts were issued in direct response to the Boston Tea Party of December 1773. By making an example of Massachusetts, the British Parliament hoped these punitive measures would reverse the trend of colonial resistance to parliamentary authority that had begun in 1765's Stamp Act. Many colonists, however, viewed the acts as an arbitrary violation of their rights. In 1774, they organized the First Continental Congress to coordinate a protest. These tensions escalated. The American Revolutionary War broke out the following year. Now, I'm reading this and I have no idea whether it is fully correct. So if anyone knows what I'm reading, and I will put the link in the description box, and they see any anomalies, please let me know, because invariably history is twisted. And we know that. But we've got to start somewhere. So the passage of the Coercive Act, the Boston Port Act, the first of the acts passed in response, because really every act is a declaration of ownership against something or somebody, putting it into the statute books, saying this is law. Whereas if we look at the law of one, we are all under God's law. We're all divine beings. And if we harm another or harm another's goods, then we will come under retribution, actually from the universe. But that is also the basis of common law. But common law basically came about through looking at the past rulings and taking, as far as I understand, taking a common denominator of what stood as the rule of law. But it was based on Christian concepts, or Judeo-Christian, certainly Christian concepts. The first of the acts passed in response to the Boston Tea Party was the Boston Port Act. The law closed the port of Boston until the East Indian Company had been repaid for the destroyed tea, and the king was satisfied that order had been restored. Colonists object that the Port Act punished all of Boston rather than the individuals who had destroyed the tea. They also contended that they were being punished without having been given an opportunity to testify in their own defense. Exactly. The Massachusetts Government Act. The Massachusetts Government Act provoked even more outrage than the Port Act because it unilaterally altered the government of Massachusetts to bring it under control of the British government. Under the terms of the Government Act, almost all positions in the colonial government were to be appointed by the governor or the king. Well, go on reading.